The truth didn't break me, silence did. That's where my story begins. Not with a courtroom, not with an argument, not even with a moment of anger, but with the quiet, suffocating stretch of days where I realized I was carrying a responsibility alone, while someone else carried only excuses. For months I lived in a strange half-life, days filled with school drop-offs and fever checks, nights spent sorting receipts, organizing care logs, documenting every breath the system might someday ask me to prove. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing for order, because order was the only thing that could protect a child caught between unreliable promises and reality. You see, people imagine custody battles as shouting matches and dramatic scenes. But the real story lives in the small details. The timestamp on a clinic visit, the quiet cough at 2 a.m., the unanswered messages, the nights when you're holding a thermometer while someone else is holding a cocktail. It's in the thin line between what someone says they do and what they actually do. This is the journey of how I learned to choose structure over chaos, documentation over emotion, clarity over fear. How I stayed steady when someone tried to twist the truth. How I protected a child by refusing to bend the rules that were meant to keep her safe. And most of all, how I discovered that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is speak softly and let the evidence speak loudly. If you want to follow the full story, the heartbreak, the discipline, the quiet victories, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. I brought my niece home later than usual, easing the front door open with the kind of careful touch you use when you're holding someone else's peace in your hands. The living room still carried a faint trace of cigarette smoke. Not sharp, just the ghost of an argument that hadn't fully left the air. She stirred against my shoulder, warm cheek pressed into my jacket. "Soup's ready for you," I whispered, even though she couldn't hear me. I carried her through the soft hallway light, the floor cool under my feet, and set her gently on the couch. Small breaths, steady and even, rose from her chest. I brushed a curl from her forehead, wishing the world were easier on children who never asked to be proof of anything. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere down the street. I didn't look. Tonight wasn't about them. It was about making sure she slept in a place where chaos didn't own the walls. Near midnight, just as the apartment settled into its predictable hush, my phone lit up with a new message. Sharp, demanding, written like a command disguised as a request. Increase the support, effective immediately. No greeting, no context, no mention of the child asleep 10 steps away. I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the cold blue glow slide across my hands. My pulse didn't spike the way it used to, it simply tightened. I exhaled through my nose and set the phone face down on the table. There are times to respond and times to refuse the invitation to chaos. Tonight belonged to the second category. I made myself a slow cup of tea and let the steam soften my shoulders. If they wanted urgency, they could negotiate with a mirror. I wasn't moving without facts, structure, or something resembling respect. Before bed, I reviewed the legal documents again. Not because I doubted them, but because certainty is a kind of armor. The temporary court order spelled it out clearly. I was the designated coordinator for the child's routines until the next hearing. Meals, medication, school drop-offs, my responsibility. I wrote it in my notebook. Custody, temporary care coordinator. A simple line, a grounding one. The lamp beside me hummed softly, its light spreading in a calm pool across the page. My niece shifted slightly on the couch, murmuring something only children understand. I tightened the blanket around her. I wasn't here to play hero or villain. I was here to keep things working while the adults in her life figured out how to stop sinking the boat they built. Sometimes boundaries start as a line in a court document. Sometimes they begin as a whisper to yourself. Stay steady. I opened my laptop and created a new folder on the desktop, Evidence 001. Then another, care_log. Not to weaponize anything, just to keep the truth from getting drowned under someone else's theatrics. Screenshots of messages, time-stamped photos, receipts tucked inside clean digital categories, the kind of structure that would make a judge nod once, maybe twice. The glow from the screen made the room feel colder around the edges. I adjusted the brightness and listened to the soft hum of the fan. Organization is its own kind of warmth. I reminded myself. Short sentences, clean records, no editorializing. It wasn't about building a case. It was about refusing to be blamed later for things I had already carried on my own back. Beside my mouse lay the green folder, a little worn, a little rough at the edges but firm in the hand. I slid my fingertips along the cover. Cool, textured, steady. I labeled it in small, deliberate handwriting. Order. Start. Inside it I placed only the essentials for now. Printed messages, basic schedules, the first log entries. Not everything belonged there yet. A folder like this deserved to grow only with proof, not emotion. The child's soft breathing filled the room like a reminder of what this was really about. I pressed the folder closed and aligned it neatly on the desk. A boundary can be a sentence. A boundary can be a folder.
Either way, it means, this time, everything will be clear. When I turned off the overhead light, the green folder caught a thin slice of the lamp's glow. A straight, clean line running down its spine like someone had drawn a boundary with a ruler. Not dramatic, not loud, just present. I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle into me. The night felt organized in a way it hadn't in months, like the first square on a grid, ready to guide the rest. I took one last look at my niece, safe under her blanket, and whispered into the dim room. We're okay. Not a promise, a direction. And tomorrow, everything would continue from here. My brother called just after sunrise, his voice threaded with that careful blend of concern and convenience people use when they want something without admitting it. Can you be flexible? He asked, just to keep the peace. I leaned against the counter, the cool surface grounding me. Outside, the early light stretched across the backyard like someone rolling out a thin sheet of gold. It's temporary, he added, softening the edge he knew I heard. I breathed in quietly. Let the paperwork speak, I said, each word calm and even. There was a pause. One of those heavy ones where the truth hangs right between you and the person who doesn't want to look at it. I just don't want drama, he murmured. Neither do I said. That's why everything stays documented. He exhaled, resigned and grateful all at once. Later that morning, I opened my notebook and began listing everything connected to the child's routines. Meals, naps, medication, reading practice, small things that weren't small at all when you were the one keeping the structure alive. I added photos from last night's dinner, a simple bowl of soup, her tiny hand gripping the spoon with sleepy determination. The apartment was quiet, except for the subtle hum of the refrigerator. The orderliness steadied me. These logs weren't about proving I was right. They were about proving she was cared for, consistently, without noise or excuses. Her morning vitamins lay on the counter in a neat line. I snapped a picture and saved it into the folder. Documentation is not distrust. It's clarity in a world allergic to accountability. By noon, the rest of the family had chimed in with their familiar chorus. Just talk it out. Don't escalate. Maybe you're overthinking. I listened politely, then placed my phone screen down. Their preference for verbal agreements had a track record, one paved with forgotten promises and convenient edits.
I opened my laptop and typed a clear message to everyone involved. All requests must come through email, no exceptions. My finger hovered over send for a moment. Not because I doubted myself, but because every boundary requires a small inhale before it becomes real. Then I clicked. The sunlight shifted across the table, a slow reminder that the world rewards those who organize their reality before others twist it. In the afternoon, I added a new document to my growing folder, finshin.xlsx, a clean spreadsheet with columns for dates, categories, and receipts. Formula checked, color-coded. I attached scanned copies of the grocery bill, the cough syrup receipt, the school supplies I picked up last week. Green for health, blue for school, yellow for daily needs. As I filled in each line, the weight on my shoulders loosened. Not because the burden was smaller, but because the shape of it was finally clear. This was not a war. It was housekeeping. Financial housekeeping for a child who deserved better than inconsistent support and shifting standards. When evening settled in, she curled against my side. Her tiny fingers hooked around the hem of my shirt, like she was afraid I might drift away if she let go. Her breath warmed the fabric, soft and trusting. Moments like this were quiet warnings. If I let myself harden too much, she would feel it before I did.
I smoothed the blanket over her legs and whispered, "You're safe. Go back to sleep." Her grip loosened a little. I wished boundaries didn't have to come wrapped in conflict, but the softness of her trust reminded me why they mattered at all. When the house finally stilled, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a single sentence at the top of my evening log. Boundaries help children, not battles. The words felt simple, almost too simple, but sometimes truth doesn't need an exclamation point. I closed the notebook and listened to the quiet hum of the night, the gentle clink of the ice maker, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Outside, a thin breeze brushed against the window screen like a careful nudge forward. Tomorrow would bring more negotiation, more requests, more tests. But tonight, everything was steady, and steadiness was its own form of protection. The next morning I stopped by the school office, the kind of place that always smelled faintly of printer ink and disinfectant wipes. The receptionist recognized me before I even finished giving my name. "You're the primary contact, right?" she asked, already reaching for a stack of forms. I nodded. "Yes, could I get her attendance sheet and the teacher's confirmation that I've been the one coordinating everything these past weeks?" She printed the documents with quick, efficient movements. The machine hummed steadily, like it understood the importance of clean copies. When she handed me the papers, I snapped a photo of the timestamp at the bottom, 7:42 a.m., clear as the morning light bleeding through the blinds. "Anything else?" she asked. "For now, that's enough." I slid the papers into my bag, feeling the small but distinct shift of order aligning itself again. Little truths neatly stacked, ready for whatever storm might come next. From there, I headed to the clinic, pushing through the automatic doors as the cool air swept across my face. The waiting room was quiet at this hour, just a mother rocking a sleepy toddler, and the rustle of a magazine someone flipped without reading. I approached the front desk and requested copies of her fever visit, the doctor's notes, and the prescription list. The nurse recognized me, too. "Poor thing was burning up that night," she murmured, as she gathered the forms. I remembered the way the child had clung to me. Cheeks flushed, breath hot and uneven. The printer spat out the paperwork in neat monochrome sheets. I scanned them immediately and saved each file with a checksum. medical_01.pdf, medical_02.pdf. No feelings, no assumptions, just records. When I stepped back outside, the air felt warmer, softer. Maybe because I had more of the truth in my hands.
Back home, I pulled up the after-school club website and downloaded their guidelines. The ones outlining attendance expectations, safety protocols, and who was permitted to pick up the children. The document was straightforward, almost aggressively so. Clear roles, clear responsibilities. Everything I wished the adults in this situation would mirror. I added the coach's name to the contact list, notating, direct source, confirms patterns. As I scrolled through the PDFs, I caught small details. The time the club ended, the rule about late pickups, the line stating children must be signed out by authorized adults only. All of it mattered, not because I wanted to trap anyone, but because clarity shrinks chaos. I organized the files into a neat sequence on my desktop. Each click felt like tightening a loose floorboard in a house that had rattled for too long. With everything gathered, I began scanning and labeling the documents. School_01 through school_05. The scanner light swept across each page like a slow, deliberate breath. I used a yellow highlighter to mark the dates down the right margin, making the timeline visible at a glance. My desk was covered in orderly stacks: attendance logs, teacher confirmations, medical notes, activity guidelines. I wasn't building an argument. I was building a map. A map that showed who consistently showed up, who consistently didn't, and who bridged the gap without complaint. The child played quietly on the floor nearby, arranging crayons by color with the same instinct for order I was using on the documents. I glanced at her and felt something settle low in my chest. A vow, silent but unshakable, to keep her world structured, even when the adults around her refused to be. Before moving on, I paused to wipe down my glasses and adjust the anti-glare filter on my monitor. The small rituals made the work feel sustainable, less like an endless grind and more like a purposeful routine. I placed my headphones on the hook above the desk, though I didn't play any music. Silence kept the edges sharp. The lamp cast a muted blue glow across the workspace, steady and cool. I reviewed each document again, not obsessively, just enough to ensure accuracy. Details mattered. A wrong date, a missing signature, a misplaced file could give someone the opening they were waiting for. When everything checked out, I leaned back in my chair and let my spine relax. The truth didn't need embellishment. It only needed to be collected with care. At the top of my evidence ledger, I wrote 2 words in clean, confident ink. Only facts, not threats, not interpretations. Just the truth, catalogued with the discipline the situation demanded. The ledger pages were crisp, the lines straight, the entries precise. Each row held a small piece of reality, a timestamp, a document ID, a cross-reference to another file. As I closed the book, the apartment felt grounded again. The child laughed softly from the living room as she played, the kind of gentle sound that made everything in me quiet down. I breathed deeply and stood, feeling the steady weight of the folder in my hands. Whatever came next, I would meet it with clarity. Clarity was the only thing that couldn't be twisted. The phone started vibrating in quick bursts just as I was reviewing the weekly care log. 3 messages in a row, each more insistent than the last, demanding an immediate advance. I flipped the device to silent and set it face down, letting the stillness reclaim the room. My attention stayed on the spreadsheet open in front of me, the one documenting the child's bedtime routines and medication schedule. Numbers didn't yell, they didn't twist themselves into threats. They simply existed, steady and reliable. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled by, its engine fading down the street. Inside, the only sound was the faint tapping of my pen against the edge of the table. They could text all they wanted. Urgency didn't equal entitlement. I inhaled slowly, anchoring myself in the work instead of the noise. To keep things transparent, I opened the banking app and pulled up the latest statement. Each expense tied directly to her needs: groceries, prescription refills, after-school snacks,
a pair of new socks she'd picked out herself with shy excitement. I exported the data into the spreadsheet, adding columns for date, category, and supporting documentation. The debit card receipts lined up perfectly, no vague charges, no blurred intentions, just care, quantified. The quiet of the apartment made the comparison feel even sharper, real support on one side, demands without accountability on the other. I adjusted the formatting, letting the clean rows settle into place. Facts have a way of speaking when people refuse to. Another message slid across the lock screen: "It's just a little extra, don't make this complicated." I stared at the words for a long, even breath before typing a measured response: "Please provide documentation of direct care expenses." Once reviewed, I will respond. Then I returned to my work. The cursor blinked calmly, refusing to mimic anyone's panic. This wasn't stubbornness, it was structure.
A refusal to blur lines simply because someone else wanted shortcuts. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun pressed a tired orange glow against the glass, stretching shadows across my desk. I let the silence between us grow, not out of spite, but dignity. Before they could claim confusion, I drafted an email, attaching the updated financial log and the corresponding receipts. Subject line: clarification required. The message was brief, professional, and traceable. I attached the spreadsheet, took a screenshot of the timestamp, and filed both into the evidence folder. There was no satisfaction in it, just the relief of consistency. When I hit send, the whoosh of the email leaving my outbox felt like a quiet line being drawn with a ruler. Nothing emotional, just order, documented. After the last vibration buzzed against the wooden table, the phone fell silent. The sudden stillness wrapped itself around the room, settling like dust after a dropped book. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the shift of air through the vent, the gentle creak of the old chair when I leaned back. Silence can be its own kind of answer, firmer than a shout, clearer than a lecture. I sat there, letting the calm return to my breath. Some people mistake quiet for surrender. They forget that quiet can also be precision. When I finally lifted the phone again, the screen stayed dark. No new messages, no attempts to negotiate the boundaries I had set. The room felt sharper somehow, like someone had drawn a clean edge around the moment. I placed the phone beside the folder and rested both palms flat on the table. There was a clarity in the air, the kind that doesn't announce itself but stands firm all the same. I closed the laptop and listened to the apartment settle. Tonight wasn't about winning. It was about keeping the line straight and steady, even if others insisted on bending it. Todasu. Dinner that evening felt like sitting at a table where everyone was pretending not to notice the smoke coming from under the door. My brother's ex-wife made a few light remarks, too light, too practiced, about how some people like to make things more complicated than they need to be. The spoon in my hand paused midair, but I set it down calmly, letting the clink against the bowl be my only answer. The child ate quietly beside me, swinging her feet under the chair, unaware of the condescension drifting across the table like a second-hand scent. I wasn't going to argue. Arguments have a way of teaching children that conflict is normal at mealtimes. So instead, I focused on her, gently reminding her to drink some water before she went back to coloring. Let them talk in riddles. I wasn't playing that game anymore. After dinner, I sent out a short, concise policy note to everyone involved. 1 page, clear requirements, no embellishments. Communication through email only. Request submitted with documentation. Response time within reason. Simple structures designed to protect us all from selective memory. I attached it to the family email thread and watched the tiny paperclip icon appear beside my message. It felt like installing a guardrail on a winding road. The apartment was quiet except for the soft scratch of the child's crayons across the page. Chaos thrives in ambiguity. I had no intention of leaving a single crack for it to leak through. Still, a part of me softened when I caught my reflection in the darkened window. A tired woman who wished things didn't have to be so rigid. A small part of me wanted to shrug it all off, to tell my brother, "Fine, let's just keep things simple," and pretend that simplicity didn't always come at my expense. But then I looked at the child curled on the floor, humming while she lined up her crayons by size. If I stayed quiet, she'd learn to stay quiet too. If I let things slide, she'd learn that chaos is normal. And if I didn't protect her routines, no one else would. So I swallowed the softness before it softened the boundaries. On my laptop, I created a new checklist to keep everything clear. Request, evidence, decision. Each column neatly aligned, each row waiting to be filled. I used square bullet points, clean, neutral, factual. Then I logged the evening, the remarks, the tension, the behavior at dinner. Not as accusations, but as observations. Clarity doesn't require anger, just consistency. When I finished, I saved the file and let the screen dim. It felt like tightening a loose screw on a door hinge, small, necessary, preventative. Later, the house finally settled into silence. I turned off the kitchen light, and the soft glow from the porch leaked through the thin curtains like a quiet reminder that the world outside kept moving, no matter who argued inside. The lamp on the desk clicked as it cooled. The child was asleep, her tiny hand resting on top of the blanket as if reaching for something she trusted to stay. I closed her door gently and stood there for a moment, letting the dim hallway light wash over me. In that small pool of gold, I felt something steady. A reminder that calm doesn't mean passive. Calm can be earned, active, intentional. Before bed, I opened my notebook and wrote the last line of the day. I will not do anything that isn't documented. The ink bled slightly into the paper, forming a firm declaration that didn't need to be loud to be true. I shut the notebook and breathed in slowly, letting the stillness settle around me like a well-fitted coat. Boundaries weren't shields, they were structure. And structure was the only thing that would keep this from becoming another mess, managed by memory and guesswork. I turned off the light, letting the room fall into its natural order again. Later that week, I sat at my desk and opened a public video someone had sent me. A clip of her at a crowded bar on the very night the child had been sick with fever. Music thumped in the background, glasses clinked, bodies swayed. She laughed into the camera, hair tossed over her shoulder, timestamp glowing clear in the corner. I didn't smile or frown. I simply saved the file, naming it with the same precision as everything else. A quiet acknowledgement that the world loved to record itself, even when doing so contradicted its own stories. The child's inhaler lay on my desk from earlier that day, tiny and blue. I glanced at it, then back at the screen. Two realities, one demanding sympathy, one requiring none. I closed the browser and exhaled slowly. I opened the care logout and traced my finger down the column for that same night. Doctor's visit, 8:43 p.m. Temperature, 102.1 degrees Fahrenheit. Medication administered, 9:15 p.m. Notes, woke twice, asking for water. On the adjacent monitor, the bar video played in silence, her smile bright, the timestamp unmistakable. The contrast was stark, so stark it didn't need commentary. I added a reference line linking the two documents. The cursor blinked once, steady and calm. I wasn't compiling this to shame her. I was compiling it so no one could rewrite the narrative later. Truth, when lined up properly, becomes its own defense. Still, a part of me refused to paint her as a villain. There was another clip, one I had watched quietly more than once, where she held the child with natural ease, brushing a stray curl from her forehead and whispering something soft enough to melt anyone's guard. In that brief moment, she wasn't careless or chaotic. She was human. I saved that clip too, labeling it differently so I wouldn't forget. Because justice without fairness becomes something else entirely. The child deserved for the adults in her life to be seen in full, not in fragments chosen for convenience. My job wasn't to erase the good. It was simply to place every piece where it belonged. Even with all that, I reminded myself of the promise I had made early on. No cheap shots, no emotional bait, no screenshots chosen for maximum humiliation. Just functional evidence, nothing more. I deleted a draft message that drifted too close to sarcasm, the kind that offers temporary satisfaction but long-term distortion. Precision matters. Tone matters. Clarity matters. And the child, asleep in the next room, deserved adults capable of restraint. I rewrote the email in neutral, clinical language and saved it without sending. Not every truth needs to be delivered immediately. Some truths only need to be preserved. A single sheet of paper slipped from the folder as I organized the files, falling with a soft, decisive tap against the floor. The sound jolted me, sharp enough to draw my eyes away from the screen. I picked it up and slid it back into place, smoothing the edges with my thumb until everything aligned again. It was such a tiny moment, but it grounded me. A reminder that even order needs tending, that the smallest shift can introduce a subtle crack if you don't correct it. I tightened the binder clip on the documents and leaned back. The apartment was quiet, except for the low hum of the heater warming the room inch by inch. When I finished for the night, I wrote a single line in the corner of my ledger. Support for the child comes from facts, not insults. The sentence settled onto the page with a weight I could feel in my chest. This wasn't about proving anyone unfit. It was about showing, clearly and calmly, where the patterns led. I closed the ledger and turned off the lamp. Letting darkness wrap around the room in clean edges, the child shifted slightly in her sleep, murmuring something dream-soft. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, steadying myself for whatever tomorrow would require. The truth would guide it, and the truth, when preserved carefully, never trembles. That morning, I opened the evidence ledger and began shaping it into something that felt less like a collection of files and more like an instrument. Clean, organized, purposeful. Columns for timestamps, sources, and projected impact. A final column labeled Use at P12/P18 sat waiting, like an empty seat in a courtroom. The structure steadied me. With every entry I added, the chaos of the last few weeks shrank into something containable, almost navigable. The child colored quietly beside me, humming as she filled the page with looping shapes. I glanced at her and felt a soft heat bloom behind my ribs. Resolve, not anger. If I was going to present anything, it would be with precision. Not because precision wins, but because it leaves no debris behind. Before responding to any new messages, I drafted a tone guide for myself. Neutral, measured, legalistic, calm. Nothing defensive, nothing emotional. Just clean sentences that moved like steady steps across a courtroom floor. I need. Please confirm. Provide documentation. I practiced saying the phrases out loud, letting them settle into my voice until they felt natural. The child giggled when she heard me repeat one of them too stiffly. I smiled back, softening my tone for her before returning to the firm cadence meant for adults. If I let emotion lead, I would lose structure. And structure was the only language everyone involved seemed to understand. Next, I drafted a short line meant to anchor all future conversations. This is what I will not do. It wasn't meant for confrontation. It was meant for clarity, an internal compass I could hold onto when negotiations inevitably twisted themselves into something messy. I saved the sentence in a notes file, highlighting it in a muted gray. As the cursor blinked, I felt the quiet truth of it settle in my chest. People often mistake refusal for stubbornness, but refusal can be a form of care. Care for the child, care for myself, care for the integrity of the process. Boundaries aren't walls. They're guidelines for where dignity begins. Once the internal preparations were set, I opened the county portal and scheduled a clerk window appointment for later in the week. No details necessary, no names needed. Just a clean transaction between me and the system designed to keep things orderly. The confirmation email appeared seconds later, its timestamp crisp and unambiguous. I saved a PDF copy and filed it into the folder. The afternoon light stretched across the wall, pale and gentle. A reminder that even formal steps could feel steadying, grounding. This wasn't a battle, it was an alignment. One document at a time, one process at a time. As I reviewed the digital copies, a tiny blue LED on the power strip flickered once, then held steady. The moment was trivial, almost laughably small. Yet it caught my attention. A blink, then order. Exactly what I wanted for all of this. I leaned back in my chair, letting the sound of the quiet apartment surround me. The low hum of the heater, the faint scratch of crayons, the soft rhythm of a home trying its best to stay calm. Clarity doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with a single flicker in a quiet room. At the end of the day, I wrote one line at the bottom of the ledger. Facts direct emotions, not the other way around. The words felt like a promise to myself, a kind of spine for everything ahead. I closed the ledger and let my fingers rest on its cover for a moment, feeling the quiet resolve settle into my bones. Tomorrow would bring more requests, more maneuvering, more attempts to twist what was simple into something slippery. But I had my tools, I had my map, I had my calm. And most importantly, I had the child sleeping safely in the next room. That was enough. More than enough. Late in the afternoon, while the child napped in her small cocoon of blankets, I checked the shared financial account and noticed a transfer that didn't belong. A chunk of the Child Living Expense Fund had been rerouted to something labeled a fundraiser dinner, an event dripping with glittery invitations and curated photos. My jaw didn't clench. My breath didn't spike. But my eyes stayed on that line of text for a long moment. The kind of mistake people make when they assume no one is paying attention. I took a screenshot, capturing the timestamp, the account number, the memo line. Clear. Undeniable. The heater clicked on behind me, blowing warm air against the back of my chair. But the room still felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Some lines aren't meant to be crossed quietly. Without waiting for excuses, I drafted a notice of misallocation, precise language, direct request. Please restore the full amount to the child's fund within 48 hours. I attached the screenshot and inserted a clean list of approved categories to avoid future misunderstandings. The email was short enough to read in one breath, but firm enough to leave no room for reinterpretation. I hovered over send for a moment, then clicked. The whoosh of the outgoing message sounded louder than usual, as if the apartment itself acknowledged a shift in the air. This wasn't conflict for the sake of conflict, it was correction. The reply came quickly. It was just confusion, don't overreact. I read the message twice, letting the words settle into the quiet of the room. Then I typed back with steady fingers. Please provide documentation of how this expense benefited the child. Once received, I will respond. I didn't send anything more. No frustration, no explanations. Just structure meeting chaos and refusing to bend. Outside, The evening light dimmed into a soft gray, painting the window in muted streaks. Sometimes the world echoes your steadiness. Sometimes it challenges it. This moment did both. To prevent further errors, I paused the automatic monthly transfers and set a manual reminder instead. A clean break from convenience, reinstated with clear oversight. The confirmation alert chimed faintly, a small digital tone that felt like placing a lock on a door that had been left open too long. I leaned back and stretched my hands, feeling the tiredness of too many weeks of vigilance. But vigilance had its place, especially when children depended on adults who didn't always grasp the weight of their choices. I saved a copy of the confirmation screen, filed it, and closed the laptop for a moment of quiet. Before leaving the desk, I threaded my fingers along the spine of the folder beside me, pressing down gently, as if grounding the day's frustration into something steadier. The firmness beneath my hand helped settle my breath. The child stirred softly on the couch behind me, rolling toward the backrest, safe and unaware. I smoothed her blanket with a soft tug, and tucked a stray curl behind her ear. Her world deserved adults who handled money with the same care they handled her sleeping body. I returned to the desk, palms warm, heart steady. I placed my keys on the table beside the documents, letting my hand stay there for a long second. Stillness can be deliberate. Stillness can be strength. The apartment was quiet except for the slow exhale of the heater and the soft ticking of the wall clock. I didn't need to raise my voice or rush my breath. The line had been drawn, clean, firm, waiting for accountability to meet it. And whether they acknowledged it or not, the next step was no longer mine. The truth would move on its own. We were running late to her after-school practice, the kind of lateness that makes a child chew their lip and tap their toes against the car seat. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I said, as I pulled into the parking lot. She nodded, gripping her little backpack tightly, her eyes bright but uncertain. We jogged together toward the gym entrance, the cool air brushing past us like an apology offered by the universe. When we finally reached her coach, he checked her in with a reassuring smile, and she slipped into line with the other kids, shoulders relaxing. I filmed a few seconds of her settling into warm-ups, a small piece of proof that stability still existed, even when everything else felt stretched thin. Moments like these didn't fix everything, but they stitched the day back together just enough. Later that night, when I tucked her into bed, she whispered into the dim room, "I'm okay now." Her voice was small, almost swallowed by the shadows, but steady enough to land in the center of my chest. I brushed my fingers through her hair, careful not to make promises I couldn't keep. "You're doing great," I said instead. She nodded once and rolled onto her side, the blanket rising and falling with her breathing. Children have a way of offering reassurance when it should be the other way around. I stayed there an extra minute, letting the quiet remind me that emotional balance matters as much as any spreadsheet. After she fell asleep, I organized the video from practice into the home log. I labeled the file homeroutine.mp4 and tagged it with one word: stability. The image of her tiny sneakers shuffling into place under fluorescent light felt like a compass pointing towards something steady. A reminder that routine is more than habit, it's emotional shelter. I placed the video alongside the weekly schedule and scanned the entries for any gaps that might hint at stress. Her days were still intact, mostly. Mostly was good enough for now. I saved everything twice, the habit of someone who doesn't rely on luck. Before closing the laptop, I added a timestamp to the care log, 8:12 p.m. The exact moment she finally settled her shoulders and exhaled in the car on the way home. I didn't write anything poetic, just the details of the evening, clean and factual. But the truth carried its own quiet warmth. The act of documenting her comfort made the apartment feel a little more grounded, like I was placing bricks along an invisible path. Some nights, the weight of everything felt heavy. Tonight, the weight felt placed, set down instead of carried. When I walked back to her room later, the faint smell of children's shampoo lingered in the air, sweet, clean, familiar. She had drifted sideways in her sleep, one arm stretched across the bed like she was reaching for something just beyond the edge. I straightened the blanket and lifted her arm gently, tucking it back under the covers. Her skin was warm, her expression peaceful. There is a kind of quiet that only exists near a sleeping child. The kind that makes you breathe more carefully, as if disturbing it would break something sacred. I let that quiet settle into me, slow and deep. Before turning in, I wrote one last line in the notebook. Children stay steady when the world around them does. The sentence was simple, but it felt like the core of everything, more meaningful than any legal note or filed receipt. I closed the notebook and leaned back in the chair, letting the stillness stretch across the room. Outside, a distant car rolled by, headlights sweeping briefly through the blinds before fading again. She was safe. Her routine, though dented, was intact. And as long as I could keep that intact, the rest of the storm could do whatever it wanted. When I met with the attorney that afternoon, his tone was steady in the way only long experience can make it. "Give them what's necessary," he said, tapping a fingertip on the edge of my folder. "Not what's emotional, not what's debatable, what's necessary." His office window cast a rectangular patch of light across the carpet, bright enough to reveal the dust drifting through the air like tiny suspended truths. I nodded, absorbing his advice the way I absorbed everything these days, quietly, carefully, without letting the weight of it show on my face. Emotions weren't the tool here. Documentation was. He handed back the folder, and I felt its familiar weight settle against my palm. "Stay consistent," he added. Consistency. One word, and yet the entire spine of this process. Back home, I set the green folder on the table and began reorganizing its contents. For weeks it had felt heavy, like a storage box for stress, late nights, and constant vigilance. But as I reshuffled the documents, removing screenshots and leaving only notarized records, medical summaries, school logs, and financial breakdowns, the weight shifted in my mind. It wasn't a burden. It was a measurement. Of order, of clarity, of what had actually happened. I pressed the folder closed and felt, for the first time, something almost like steadiness radiate from it. Evidence doesn't need emotion to speak. It needs sequence. Later, I practiced saying a single line in the living room, my voice low so it wouldn't disturb the child napping in the next room. Please compare this timestamp with the one previously submitted. Short, neutral, precise. The kind of sentence that removes any opportunity for misinterpretation. I repeated it until the cadence became comfortable, until the firmness beneath the neutrality felt natural. Across the room, a shadow shifted as the afternoon light tilted, turning the wall a muted gold. I breathed slowly, matching the calm of the space. Not everything had to be confrontational. Some things simply needed to be factual. On my laptop, I exported the full timeline. Healthcare records first, school documentation second, daily routine logs third, and financial support entries last. Everything organized in the order a judge would expect. Clean, logical, undeniable. I numbered each section, triple-checked the formatting, and saved the file with a clear label. Then I printed a hard copy, the pages warm against my fingertips as they stacked themselves neatly on the desk. Each document felt like a small light. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic, but clear enough to guide the way through a complicated process. I set the completed timeline beside the folder and allowed myself one long exhale. The chair gave a soft creak when I sat back, the sound settling into the calm of the room. Beside me, a half-finished cup of coffee had grown cold, its surface reflecting the dim lamp like a tiny stilled lake. I reached for the stack of papers and made a duplicate set, sliding each page into place with quiet intention. Order wasn't just a task. It was a rhythm, one that pulled me forward even when fatigue dragged at the edges of my thoughts. I checked on the child between batches of printing, brushing a hand over her hair as she slept. Everything in her world was soft and warm, so it was my job to keep the structure around it steady. When everything was finally organized, I wrote a brief line in the notebook beside me. Justice requires repetition. Not repetition of conflict, but repetition of order. The same truths presented the same way, again and again, until there was no room for distortion. I closed the notebook and rested my hands on the table, letting the quiet settle around me like a slow, grounding breath. The night outside was calm, the house still. This wasn't the midpoint of a battle. It was the midpoint of clarity. And clarity, once built, doesn't crumble easily. The next morning I sat at the dining table with a fresh stack of forms, contact authorizations, emergency information, visitation notes, healthcare updates. Each one needed to be filled out cleanly, without hesitation, without a single blank box left to interpretation. The pen moved steadily across the paper, the faint scratch of ink forming answers with the clarity the situation demanded. Outside, the early light filtered through the curtains in soft stripes, casting pale patterns across the table. I reviewed each section twice before moving to the next, as if the forms themselves required the steadiness I was trying so hard to maintain. When I finished, I placed them in a neat stack, feeling the comforting weight of something done correctly. Later, I called the child's coach to request a simple confirmation of attendance and routine. He answered with his usual easy calm, the kind that suggested he'd seen enough families to know when things were complicated behind closed doors. "Sure, I can put that in writing," he said. I could hear the muffled thump of basketballs in the background, kids shouting and bursts of laughter. When the email arrived minutes later, I opened it carefully. One line, clear and time-stamped. I saved it to the folder and snapped a quick screenshot for the archive. Small confirmations matter. They're the bricks that hold up larger truths. As I cross-checked everything, I noticed a gap. Last week's after-school reading session. I called the school librarian, half expecting her to put me on hold. Instead, she remembered the child immediately. "Oh, she stayed for story time," the woman said warmly. She was quiet but very focused. She sent me the attendance note while we were still on the phone. Another piece of the puzzle placed exactly where it belonged. I added it to the timeline, aligning it with the rest of the week. The order felt right, like tightening the final knot on something that needed to hold. By early evening, my desk had turned into a landscape of color-coded sections: blue for school, green for health, yellow for routines. Each page slid into a labeled divider, clean and crisp. There was something grounding in the physicality of it, in handling the documents one by one, arranging them with precise, almost meditative care. It reminded me that even in complicated situations, order is something you can build with your hands. I closed each binder with a firm click, the kind of sound that marks progress without needing applause. My hands felt dry from the constant sorting, so I reached for a small bottle of hand cream on the table. The scent was faint and calming, a reminder to slow down, at least for a moment. When I returned to the papers, the machine-like rhythm softened just enough to feel human again. I reviewed the final checklist, every signature accounted for, every date aligned, every supporting document clipped neatly behind the appropriate form. The apartment was quiet, the child drawing in the living room with soft concentration. The stillness felt earned. At last, I logged into the scheduling portal for the temporary hearing and confirmed the date. The appointment sat on the screen like a fixed point in an otherwise shifting landscape. I saved the confirmation, printed a copy, and slid it into the front sleeve of the binder. Then I sat back, letting a long breath leave my chest. Preparation wasn't victory, but it was grounding, a steadying reminder that when the moment came, I would walk into it with clarity, not noise. I closed the binder gently, as if sealing the entire week inside it. The clerk's office was colder than I expected when I stepped inside that morning. Bright fluorescent lights washed the counters in a pale, unwavering glow, the kind that erased shadows and demanded honesty. I held the folder close against my side as I approached the window, the documents inside perfectly aligned, each page in silent formation. The clerk didn't smile, but she didn't need to. She simply extended her hand and I placed the folder into it, with a calm I had rehearsed more times than I'd admit. For a brief moment, the light hit the green cover directly, illuminating it as if it were the only solid thing in the entire room. This was the pivot point, not a confrontation, an arrival. She opened the folder and flipped through the pages with practiced efficiency. Receipts, attendance logs, medical notes, timelines, confirmations. "Complete," she murmured, tapping a small stamp on the corner of each form. The sound of each stamp landing felt like a quiet drumbeat, anchoring the moment. I slid the additional documents across the counter. The financial ledger, the updated care log, the timeline summary. Her eyes passed over the timestamps, the signatures, the attachments. "Everything meets submission standards," she said. Something inside me unclenched. Not relief exactly, but confirmation that the order I had built was seen, recognized, held. When she asked my purpose, I answered in the even tone I'd practiced for days. "My goal is stability for the child, that's all. No edge, no embellishment, just the truth delivered cleanly." She nodded once, more like a formality than approval, but it was enough. The overhead light hummed above us, steady and bright, reflecting off the counter in a thin line that looked almost deliberate. In that moment, I realized that clarity doesn't need to be defended when it's documented. It simply stands on its own. She handed me the stamped receipt of submission, the ink still faintly warm. I reviewed it carefully. Case number, timestamp, document count, next steps. Every detail accounted for. As I signed the acknowledgement, the pen glided smoothly, leaving a neat line of ink that felt like a quiet signature on weeks of discipline. She placed a copy into a clear envelope and slid it back to me. I tucked it into my bag with the same care I used for everything else in this process. Walking away from the counter, the hallway felt longer than before, as if the building itself understood the weight of what had just been placed into its system. Outside, the air was still. No cars rushing by, no conversation spilling onto the sidewalk, just a muted quiet that felt almost ceremonial. I stopped near the entrance to check the receipt again, pressing my thumb lightly against the embossed seal. The child's name printed near the top reminded me why every step mattered, why every late night, every log entry, every clipped receipt, every boundary stood exactly where it needed to. I breathed in, slow and deep, letting the cold morning air sharpen the moment. There was no pride in this, just purpose.
And purpose is steadier than victory. As I walked back to the car, the bright reflection from one of the office windows caught my eye. A narrow, straight strip of light cutting across the concrete like a ruler marking the path. I paused for a second, letting the stillness settle around me.
The folder in my bag felt lighter now, not because it contained less, but because it had finally been placed where it belonged. Everything leading up to this moment had been preparation. Everything after it would be response. I opened the car door, sat inside, and allowed one long, steady breath to leave my chest. The line had been drawn, and clarity would carry the rest. That evening, my phone lit up with another message from her. This one framed as an apology, though the wording slipped quickly into justification. "Sorry if I was too harsh," it began, followed immediately by a renewed push to increase support. The apology dissolved under the weight of the demand. I read it twice in silence, letting the tone settle into place like a piece in a puzzle I already knew by heart. Instead of responding, I opened my laptop and pulled up the checklist. I typed a short reply using the structure I'd built. Clear terms, defined requirements, no emotional padding. Her message had sprawled. Mine was clean. Please review the attached conditions. Responses must follow the outlined criteria. The cursor blinked calmly after I hit send. Even a storm looks smaller when everything is documented. The next message came minutes later. "Let's talk in person. It'll be faster." I stared at the screen, feeling the familiar tug toward tension-filled conversations where boundaries dissolve under pressure. I had walked into those traps before. Not again. I typed, "All communication will go through representatives. I won't meet privately." No explanation, no apology, just structure. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere down the street, echoing through the quiet evening.
The child was coloring at the table, humming softly, completely unaware that her stability depended on choices like this. Quiet refusals that protected her from conflicts she never asked to witness. I put the phone face down, anchoring the moment. A new request arrived not long after. "Send the real schedule, not the edited one." The accusation didn't sting. It was too predictable, too familiar. I opened the document that outlined the proposed 90-day schedule, the one I had sent days earlier, the one still sitting unanswered. They hadn't reviewed it, or they didn't want to. I highlighted the section with the dates and added a calm line beneath it. "This is the verified schedule. Please confirm receipt so we can finalize." When I sent it, I marked the email in red on my log, noting the lack of previous acknowledgement. Tracking avoidance was as important as tracking action. Patterns matter. The truth often lives between the lines people refuse to answer. Later, while washing dishes, I heard the faint creak of the screen door on the porch, the old spring pulling it shut with a tired metallic sigh. The sound made me pause, letting the warm water run over my hands. It was a quiet reminder that small noises can echo loudly when your mind is already crowded. I dried my hands slowly, grounding myself in the simplicity of the moment. A kitchen cooling for the night. The child in her pajamas reading softly to her stuffed rabbit. The soft glow of a lamp warming the hallway. Conflict may arrive loudly, but steadiness arrives in small, deliberate breaths. I walked back to the living room and sat beside her, letting the ordinary moment anchor me again. Before heading to bed, I opened the evidence folder to check one last detail. The short clip I had labeled Humanity. The video of her gently brushing the child's hair had always reminded me not to paint her with a single stroke. I watched it again. Just a few seconds. Just enough to remember that all people contain contradictions. Strength doesn't come from ignoring the complexity. It comes from choosing not to weaponize it. I saved the updated notes and closed the device. Fairness isn't softness. Fairness is discipline. And discipline is what kept this process intact. Before sleeping, I wrote one line in the corner of the notebook. No negotiations outside the legal frame. It wasn't a warning.
It was a reminder to myself, an anchor against the emotional pull of guilt, pressure, and old habits. The house was quiet now, the kind of quiet that settles deeply into the walls after a long day. I turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the dim room, watching the child breathe softly under her blanket. Whatever tomorrow brought, the rules were set, and I wasn't stepping outside them. Not for anyone. Not anymore. 5. The three-way coordination call began with the kind of stiff politeness that cracks if you breathe too hard. My attorney joined first, his voice calm and steady. Their representative joined second, carrying the edge of defensiveness before a single word was spoken. When they asked for a summary, I recited the timestamps and evidence as though reading from a script I had spent weeks memorizing. Doctor visits, attendance logs, medication records, scheduled deviations, confirmed care nights. Each detail was delivered cleanly, without commentary, the way facts were meant to be handled. The child sat at the kitchen table drawing quietly, unaware that the structure of her life was being weighed on a phone line inches away. I kept my tone low and even, matching the quiet of the space around me. Nothing rushed, nothing emotional. Just truth laid out in sequential order. Predictably, their representative leaned on the familiar phrase, "given the circumstances," a blanket explanation, stretched thin from overuse. I listened without interrupting, letting the vagueness unravel itself. When they finished, I asked one question. Can you provide documentation of direct care during the periods in question? Silence. A long one. Even through the phone, the absence of an answer felt loud. My attorney cleared his throat softly, the sound of someone who has seen this pattern too many times. "It's a reasonable request," he said, reinforcing the line I had already drawn. The representative finally muttered something about checking their records, but we all knew what that silence meant. To keep the conversation grounded, I presented the comparison chart I had prepared, the one showing who had taken the child to her appointments, who had managed school pickups, who had stayed home on sick days. The lines on the page were straight, measured, undeniable. "Please review the timeline," I said, keeping my voice even. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke with a precision words often fail to match. My attorney chimed in gently, noting that the chart would be included in the formal submission unless contested. Their representative shifted in tone, trying to reframe the issue, but the chart had already done its work. Facts don't argue, they simply reveal. The call stretched on, punctuated by the soft tapping of my attorney's pen and the measured inhales I took between statements. At one point, their representative tried to shift the topic to emotional grievances, but I stayed anchored in documentation. "Let's stay within the scope of the coordination meeting," I said. My tone didn't rise, it didn't bend, it simply held. The child looked up from her drawing and smiled at me, unaware she was the quiet center of this storm. I smiled back, letting that tiny exchange steady me before returning to the conversation. Stability can come from the smallest glance. By the end of the call, it was clear no agreement had been reached. Their representative requested time to review, though it sounded more like buying time than searching for truth. Still, I didn't push. Some delays reveal more than answers. My attorney drafted a brief summary while I emailed the call notes to my own log, attaching the comparison chart and marking the entry with today's date. The apartment felt heavier when I finally set the phone down, but not in a way that frightened me, more like the weight of something nearing its next step. Before closing my laptop, I typed one line at the bottom of the entry. Next presentation scheduled for P18. A simple reminder, a marker for the next time the evidence would speak on its own terms. I closed the screen and let the room exhale with me, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the space. The child finished her drawing and held it up proudly. A house, a sun, a row of flowers in uneven colors. I took it gently, smoothing the page with my thumb. Even in the tension of unresolved decisions, small moments of quiet joy still bloomed. Late one night, while the child slept curled on her side with her hand tucked beneath her cheek, I opened another video someone had forwarded. The thumbnail alone made my stomach tighten. Neon lights, crowded tables, the unmistakable pulse of nightlife. When I clicked play, the footage confirmed what I already suspected. She was at the bar again, laughing freely, the timestamp matching the exact hour the child had been coughing herself awake with a fever. The music in the clip was loud, but I muted it immediately. I didn't need the sound, the image was enough. I saved the video under a new label, my fingers moving steadily despite the heaviness creeping into my chest. Truth doesn't ask how you feel about it. It just sits there, undeniable. The next day, when confronted, she tried to dismiss the footage. "You probably tagged the wrong place," she said. "People make mistakes." Her tone was casual, almost breezy. I didn't argue. Instead, I opened the metadata file on my laptop, highlighting the geolocation marker, the posting time, the device signature.
"I pulled this directly from the source," I said evenly.
Silence stretched between us, thin and brittle. She didn't acknowledge the evidence, but she didn't deny it again either. Denial dissolves quickly in the face of a timestamp. I saved the metadata screenshot in the folder, labeling it with the same calm precision I used for everything else. As I reorganized the folder later, a thin sheet of paper slid out and fell to the floor with a small, crisp sound. I bent down and picked it up, one of the earlier printouts I had marked as incomplete weeks ago. The edges were slightly curled from handling, but the document was still clean. I placed it back into the folder and tightened the clip, smoothing my thumb along the top edge. The movement felt almost symbolic, a gesture of closing something that had been frayed too long. Even the smallest physical motions can echo with clarity when you're navigating uncertainty. Every piece of paper mattered now. Every detail belonged to the same story. I opened a new subfolder on my laptop and labeled it Disproof 01. Inside it, I placed the video, the metadata, and a short one-line annotation. Contradiction to stated timeline. Nothing more. No commentary. No anger spilled into the file names. I printed a copy of the annotation and tucked it behind the timeline summary, the paper sliding into place with a gentle whisper. Evidence doesn't need dramatics. It just needs to be organized so its meaning can't be denied. When I closed the laptop, the lid clicked with a quiet finality that settled into the room. Later that night, I checked on the child. She had rolled closer to the edge of the bed, her head leaning toward the space where I usually sat while she fell asleep. Her breathing was soft, rhythmic, almost musical. I brushed her hair back, letting my fingers rest for a moment against the warmth of her small forehead. There was a tenderness in these moments that made the rest of the world, its excuses, its inconsistencies, feel distant. This was the center, not the arguments, not the negotiations. This quiet child, trusting the world to make sense for her, was the reason every boundary mattered. Before turning in, I wrote one final line in my notebook. Enough evidence to counter the explanation. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't bitter. It was simply true. The air in the apartment felt still, like everything had paused to acknowledge the weight of the moment. Tomorrow would bring more decisions, more conversations, more attempts at rewriting what had already been documented. But I had what I needed now, calmly gathered, clearly organized. The fracture had finally shown itself without disguise, and I was ready for whatever followed. The next morning, I called the pediatrician's office to request a written statement about the child's disrupted sleep patterns during the weeks of inconsistent care. The receptionist recognized my voice immediately and transferred me to the nurse, who spoke with a gentleness sharpened by professionalism. "We'll prepare the note," she said. "It'll include the dates you brought her in and the observed effects." I thanked her and hung up, letting the quiet settle back into the apartment. The child was building a puzzle on the living room rug, her small hands working with careful intent. Her world was made of simple pieces, shapes and colors, edges that fit cleanly. I wished the adults around her operated with the same clarity. I returned to the table and added the pending note to my checklist, drawing a clean line beside it. That afternoon, I organized the expenses again: medication, held healthcare, healthy groceries, transit to and from appointments, after-school supplies. I created a new sheet labeled Needs versus Wants, not to judge anyone, but to build a framework that couldn't be twisted later. Needs were highlighted in blue. Wants remained uncolored. The distinction was quiet, but unmistakable.
I uploaded the receipts in chronological order and scanned the categories for patterns. The truth aligned itself calmly on the page, row by row. This wasn't about winning. It was about reflecting reality exactly as it was, without embellishment, without erasure. I saved the file twice, then printed a hard copy to slide under the most recent documents. In the early evening, a relative called with unsolicited commentary, the kind that masquerades as concern. "She's imagining things," they said. "Kids exaggerate, they don't keep track." I listened in quiet silence, letting their words fade into the background like static from an old radio. Responding would only pull me into a circular argument, and circular arguments have no exit. When they paused, waiting for agreement, I simply said, "Thank you for calling," and ended the conversation. The stillness afterward felt cleaner, like stepping out of a room filled with dust. Children don't exaggerate stability. They feel it, or they don't. Later, I folded clothes fresh from the dryer. Tiny shirts, soft pajamas, leggings with little stars printed across the knees. The scent of warm cotton filled the hallway, soft and familiar. As I placed each item into the dresser, I felt the slow uncoiling of tension in my chest. Care isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or demand applause. It shows up in routines, in folded clothes, in quiet consistency. The child peeked into the room, leaning against the doorframe with a sleepy smile. "You're fast," she giggled. "Only with laundry," I said, brushing her hair as she wandered in. These were the moments that reminded me why every documented step mattered. Once she was asleep, I turned on the desk lamp and drafted the supplemental evidence email for the court. Subject line: Supplemental evidence, sleep and care disruptions. I attached the new expense sheet, a summary of observations, and a short note outlining recent inconsistencies. No accusations, no speculation. Just the facts, arranged in clean paragraphs. When I clicked send, the room seemed to release a small breath with me, as though the apartment itself understood the gravity and steadiness of the step. I saved a screenshot of the confirmation and placed it into the expanding folder. Before ending the night, I opened my notebook and wrote one more line beneath the date. A child's well-being is a straight path. Not curved, not complicated, just straight, measured by sleep, safety, consistency, and care. I closed the notebook and rested my palm over it for a moment, letting the truth settle into my bones. The house was quiet, warm, steady. Whatever turbulence waited ahead, I had already cleared the path on my side. The rest would reveal itself soon enough. That morning, before the rush of emails and expectations could begin,
I sat at the table and wrote out the core purpose of everything I had done so far. Not for the court. Not for them. For myself. To create stability for the child, not to punish anyone. The sentence sat in the center of the page, plain and unadorned. But it steadied my ribs in a way I hadn't expected. Justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's just orderly. A quiet spine holding everything upright. I closed the notebook and looked toward the hallway where the child's room glowed with morning light. The day would demand clarity, and I was ready to give it. By noon, I finalized the proposal I had been shaping for days, one that kept the current support structure intact, only increasing if there was verifiable, consistent involvement in the child's care. Measured criteria, documented requirements. Nothing subjective that could be twisted into argument. It wasn't a wall. It was a fair invitation to meet the responsibilities already expected. I prepared the document with clean bullet points, each one no longer than a sentence. The child played nearby, building towers from wooden blocks, knocking them down only to stack them again. Her small repetition mirrored my own. Order, then reorder, until things stood the way they should. When the draft was complete, I attached the foundational evidence: care logs, financial records, medical notes, school confirmations, each item supporting the principle that participation, not assumption, determines fairness. As I reviewed the packet, I realized how much of it came from quiet evenings, steady mornings, and decisions made in the margins of exhaustion. I scrolled through the document and added one final reference to the timeline, linking each claim to its source. Clarity doesn't survive without structure. Structure doesn't survive without evidence. The two fed each other, forming a shape that could stand on its own. I emailed the draft terms to my attorney and waited. The clock ticked softly on the wall, its sound almost soothing in the stillness of the afternoon. Minutes later, he responded with a single line. Well done. Clear, measurable, defensible. I let the words settle, not as praise, but as validation that the effort had direction. I forwarded the proposal to their representative with tracked changes enabled. If they chose to argue, they would have to argue with facts, not vague discomfort. The child climbed onto my lap mid-email, her hair warm from the sun. I held her for a moment before finishing the last line. Some truths are easier to type when reminded of who they protect. My brother texted not long after. How's everything going? Want me to talk to her? I stared at the message for a moment, feeling the tug of old habits. Letting him mediate, letting him smooth things over. But this wasn't a conflict between adults. It was a question of responsibility. I've handled it, I replied. He sent back a simple, thank you. I looked at the folder on the table, its edges neatly aligned. Sometimes the quietest victories are the ones where no one has to yell for clarity to appear. Before ending the day, I wrote one more sentence at the bottom of the page. The door is half closed now. Not slammed, not locked, just closing, inch by inch, with every clear boundary and every consistent step. The child was asleep, curled under her blanket with her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the quiet of her breathing settle into the house. Whatever came next would be met with the same steadiness. The path was marked, the logic was sound, and I was no longer stepping backward. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, quiet, neutral, almost hushed in a way that made every breath sound deliberate. Their representative entered first, avoiding eye contact. When the clerk asked about the documented care schedule, she shifted in her seat and answered with vague phrases that floated without ever landing. I don't have those details in front of me, she said. The judge waited. Silence expanded across the room, patient and unblinking. I leaned forward slightly and spoke in an even tone. The dates in question are recorded. I'm prepared to provide the specific timestamps. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Facts don't flinch under scrutiny. The representative swallowed, glancing at her papers without finding anything that could anchor her answer. The moment hung there, quiet, revealing, unmistakable. When it was my turn, I opened the evidence ledger and placed it gently on the table, the pages aligned, tabs visible. This outlines all care activities, I said, sliding the chart forward. Doctor visits, medication administration, attendance logs. Everything correlates with the timeline previously submitted. The judge nodded once, studying the documents. I clicked on the projector remote and displayed the comparison chart linking two critical nights, the bar footage and the medical visit. The screen glowed softly, casting a pale reflection onto the tabletop. No dramatics. Just two columns. One showing where I was, one showing where she was. The kind of contrast that didn't need narration. It spoke quietly. It spoke clearly. It spoke enough. When I began speaking, I used the cadence I had practiced for weeks. Short sentences, calm tone, no emotional sway. For this date, the child was running a fever. I administered medication at the time listed here. Swipe. On this date, she missed school due to care inconsistency. Swipe. Here is the timestamp for the clinic visit, followed by the attendance confirmation. The judge watched each line with steady attention. Their representative tried to interject once, but the judge raised a hand gently. Let her finish. I continued, unbothered. Not once did my voice tremble. It wasn't confidence, it was clarity. Clarity earned through every late-night file, every labeled document, every careful breath. One moment carried more weight than the rest. The night of the medical visit that overlapped perfectly with her footage at the bar. I projected the timeline arrow, bright, sharp, undeniable, showing how the two events intersected. This is the discrepancy, I said simply. The representative shifted again, offering an explanation that unraveled before the first sentence ended. Too vague, too convenient. The judge leaned back slightly, assessing both sides with an expression that revealed nothing but absorbed everything. This will be taken into account, he said. Not a victory, not a reprimand, just acknowledgement. Sometimes acknowledgement is the strongest statement in the room. Near the end, the representative proposed a partial agreement, an increase in support with everything else to be discussed later. I kept my gaze steady. No, I said. Adjustments will be based on documented care, not demands. My attorney nodded, hands folded calmly on the table. The judge glanced between us, noting the firmness of the stance, the consistency of the evidence. The proposed 90-day schedule was reviewed next. I agreed immediately. It was already aligned with the child's best interest. They hesitated, but hesitation doesn't outweigh documentation. The structure was set. All that remained was acknowledgement. As the session closed, I stood with a quiet steadiness that came from something deeper than confidence, a kind of alignment, where everything I had carried, organized, logged, and spoken settled into place without shaking. Walking out of the room, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt correct. The truth had walked itself through every line, every timestamp, every calm sentence. I paused at the end of the hallway, letting one long breath leave my chest. Behind me, the door clicked shut, soft, final, unforced. Ahead of me lay the next step, whatever shape it came in, and I was ready, completely ready. 2 days after the hearing, her representative emailed with a proposal framed as reasonable. An immediate increase in support to show goodwill while everything gets sorted out. I stared at the message, feeling its familiar shape, urgency disguised as cooperation. I type slowly, letting each word land with intention. Adjustments will occur only if direct care increases and is verified. No edge, no softness, just the same structure that had guided every step. They wrote again, pushing the narrative of compromise. But compromise without accountability is just another form of pressure. I read their message once, then closed the laptop. Sometimes clarity looks like refusal. Sometimes refusal is the most honest form of care. By afternoon, a new message arrived, this one shorter, sharper. A half-formed threat tucked behind vague phrasing. We don't want this to get more complicated for you. I let the words sit there on the screen, unblinking. Fear is a tool people reach for when logic won't bend in their direction. My reply was a single sentence. Terms will not be influenced by intimidation. When I hit send, the stillness in the room deepened, like the air itself had decided which side of the line it stood on. The child played quietly nearby, building a cardboard fort, unaware that these small battles kept her world upright. I watched her fold a flap into place, steady and focused. Even she understood structure better than the adults making demands. That evening, as the light softened into amber, I reviewed the documents one more time, not to find flaws, but to assure myself that everything was aligned. My hands were steady as I turned each page, the rhythm almost meditative. The evidence was complete, nothing missing, nothing overstated. When I reached the final section, I paused, letting the weight of the preparation settle in my chest. This wasn't about certainty of outcome. It was about certainty of integrity. I had followed every step, every guideline, every requirement. The truth didn't need my permission to stand. It simply needed space. On my desktop, the file labeled final_proposed waited. I opened it one more time, reviewing the terms with a deliberate calm. Measured requirements, clear triggers for adjustments, transparent reporting. Nothing punitive, nothing emotional. Everything structured around the child's well-being. I sent a short message to my attorney. Ready whenever you are. He replied with a simple checkmark. I sat back in my chair, the soft creak echoing in the quiet room. Outside, a distant dog barked once, then silence settled again. Even the world seemed to pause, as if recognizing the stillness before a turning point. A few minutes later, I opened a message from my attorney, confirming the timeline for the ruling. It wasn't final, but the direction was clear. The court favored order over improvisation, stability over convenience. I let the information settle, not as victory, but as confirmation that the work had meant something. The child walked over with a marker in her hand, asking quietly if I could help her draw a tree. I set the laptop aside and knelt beside her, sketching branches that reached upward in wide, steady arcs. She added leaves in mismatched colors, unconcerned with rules or symmetry. Her world didn't need to be perfect, just stable. Before bed, I wrote the final line of the day. A straight line doesn't wander. The sentence felt like a quiet declaration, neither boastful nor defensive, just true. I closed the notebook and stood by the child's doorway, listening to her slow, even breathing. This was the quiet I had been protecting from the beginning. Not silence, but safety. The night settled around us, steady and unhurried, as if acknowledging that the next step belonged to the court, not to negotiation or fear. Whatever the ruling brought, I would meet it with the same clarity that had carried me this far. The line was drawn, and I wasn't stepping off it. The draft agreement arrived in my inbox just after sunrise, the subject line sharp and unmistakable. I opened it slowly, reading each clause with the same careful attention I'd given every document in the past weeks. Verification thresholds, quarterly reviews, clear consequences for noncompliance, written in simple, unambiguous language. Nothing overextended, nothing punitive, just structure, steady and fair. I added a few notes to ensure every provision was measurable, trimming unnecessary sentences until each point sat at 2 lines or less. The sun slipped across the living room floor as I worked, warming the edge of the pages. The child played nearby, humming softly as she built another tower from wooden blocks. This, I thought, is what stability sounds like. When I reached the section on oversight, I made one revision. Quarterly audits. A right to request supporting documentation within a defined window. Clear scope, clear timeline, clear boundaries. I typed each line with the same calm precision I'd been cultivating, reviewing the language twice before moving to the next paragraph. It wasn't about mistrust. It was about transparency, something that had been in short supply until I'd built it myself. My attorney reviewed the changes and replied with a short approving note. The child wandered into the room to show me a paper crown she'd made, the crooked jewel glued slightly off-center. I placed it gently on her head. "Perfect," I said, because it was. By afternoon, they responded with complaints. "This is too rigid. This is too complicated. You're making this difficult." I read each message without letting a single word press into my nerves. Structure only feels heavy to those who prefer chaos. I type slowly. Clarity prevents conflict. The terms are measured and reasonable. There was no anger in it, just steadiness. A few minutes later, another message arrived. "Can't we simplify?" I didn't respond immediately. Some answers need time to settle into the space between what is wanted and what is required. When I finally replied, my tone remained even. Simple has not worked. These terms ensure fairness and accountability. I made final adjustments to the document, ensuring every requirement was limited to exactly what the child needed. Nothing more, nothing less. Then I printed the agreement, the pages warm beneath my fingertips, and signed where instructed. The sound of the pen gliding across the paper felt deliberate, like marking the end of a long corridor. I scanned the signed document and uploaded it to the system. The confirmation code appeared immediately, a small, bright string of letters and numbers that carried more weight than it looked. The final step was sending the executed version. I attached the file to a clean, concise email. Attached is the finalized agreement. No commentary, no elaboration, just fact. When the message left my outbox, I felt the quiet shift of responsibility settling where it belonged, distributed evenly, documented clearly. The child tugged at my sleeve, asking if we could go outside. The late afternoon light had turned the porch a soft, honey-colored gold. "Let's go," I said, taking her hand and stepping into the calm air. For a moment, the world felt suspended in warm quiet. That night, after she fell asleep, I wrote the closing line of the day. Rules will speak for us when we choose not to fight. I closed the notebook, letting the weight of the week settle into its pages. The apartment was still, touched only by the gentle hum of the heater and the soft rhythm of her breathing from the next room. The agreement was filed. The expectations were set. The structure, the one I had built, piece by piece, day by day, now stood on its own. I turned off the last light and let the darkness settle in careful, quiet layers. Whatever followed, the rules would hold their shape. 3 days passed with no reply from their side. No complaints, no revisions, no new demands disguised as negotiations. The silence wasn't peaceful, but it wasn't hostile either. It felt more like a system resetting itself, gears shifting into a configuration that no longer required constant intervention. On the 4th morning, a single message arrived. Received. Nothing more. I read it once, then closed the phone gently. There was no triumph in the acknowledgement, only the soft confirmation that the work, the weeks of documenting, clarifying, tightening, had finally settled into place. The child was at the table eating her cereal, swinging her legs under the chair with an absent rhythm. "Good morning," she said, milk mustache and all. "Good morning, sweetheart." The world continued, quiet and unbothered. Later, while folding the clean laundry, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. Subtle, almost fragile. Not relief exactly, but the absence of constant weight. I sorted her tiny socks, lining each pair in neat rows along the hallway floor. The simple order of it soothed me more than I expected. Behind me, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my attorney. Agreement finalized. Court will file it before the weekend. I exhaled slowly, letting the information settle like a stone sinking into deep water. Not loud, not fast, just inevitable. Stability isn't a moment. It's a series of small confirmations that accumulate until the ground feels steady again. That afternoon, while the child napped, I opened my laptop and reviewed the entire ledger one final time. Not because anything needed changing, but because I needed to see the journey laid out in front of me. Page by page, timestamp by timestamp, line by line. Every step was there. The late nights, the careful documentation, the neutral messages that resisted emotional traps, the boundaries I held even when they were tested. Seeing it all together didn't make me proud. It made me calm. Clarity had been earned, not given. When I reached the final page, I closed the file and let my fingers rest on the keyboard for a long moment, breathing evenly. In the late afternoon, the child woke with messy hair and sleepy eyes, wandering into the living room with her stuffed rabbit tucked against her chest. She climbed into my lap without a word, curling into me as if she knew the day had shifted in some quiet way. We sat like that for a long time, the soft glow of the lamp warming the room, the hum of the refrigerator pulsing gently in the background. It struck me then how much of this process had been about protecting moments like this, gentle, ordinary, undisturbed. Adult complications should never spill into a child's world, and now, finally, they wouldn't. As evening fell, I stepped onto the porch while the child played inside. The air was cool, almost crisp, carrying the faint scent of someone's distant dinner drifting through the neighborhood. Across the street, porch lights blinked on one by one, small pockets of warmth settling over quiet houses. I leaned against the railing, letting the stillness wash over me. No incoming demands, no shifting narratives, no new fires to put out. Just the simple, steady hum of a life that had stopped shaking long enough for me to breathe in full. Sometimes peace doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in silence. Before bed, I opened my notebook to the last filled page and added a single sentence beneath it. Stability is not the end. It is the beginning. The words landed softly, almost like a whisper meant only for myself. I closed the notebook, placed it on the nightstand, and checked on the child one more time. She slept deeply, arms spread, face relaxed in a way that only children manage after a day without tension. I turned off the remaining lights, letting the apartment settle into a calm, even darkness. Tomorrow would be ordinary, and after everything we had walked through, ordinary felt like the sweetest kind of gift. The ruling arrived on a quiet Friday morning, tucked between a utility bill and a grocery flyer in the mailbox. No dramatic envelope, no heavy seal, just a plain white letter carrying months of work inside it. I opened it at the kitchen counter, the child sitting a few feet away, drawing a sun with uneven rays. The terms were simple. The agreement was accepted exactly as written, oversight included, timelines intact, responsibilities evenly assigned. No additions, no revisions, no unexpected lines squeezed into the margins. I read it twice, not to absorb the decision, but to confirm that clarity had finally been recognized on paper. The apartment felt still in a way that wasn't heavy, just settled. Like dust sinking after a long disturbance. I scanned the ruling and added it to the ledger, placing it in the final tab labeled Completed. The binder closed with a soft click that carried a weight no one else would ever fully understand. The journey wasn't heroic, it wasn't dramatic. It was disciplined, built from quiet nights, careful sentences, and boundaries I refused to loosen even when pushed. I set the binder on the shelf beside the other household documents. It looked almost ordinary there, its green spine blending with envelopes and manuals. Strange how something that consumed so much space in my mind now occupied only 2 inches of physical room. Sometimes peace fits where chaos could not. That afternoon, the child asked to go to the park. It felt symbolic in a way she couldn't possibly know, but I didn't overthink it. We walked slowly along the sidewalk, her tiny hand wrapped around 2 of my fingers. The sky was a soft, open blue, the kind that makes everything else feel small and manageable. She ran toward the swings, her laughter rising in little bursts that echoed across the empty field. I sat on the bench, watching her pump her legs, trying to fly higher with earnest concentration. There was no phone buzzing in my pocket, no unread messages waiting to twist the day, just sunlight, breath, and small joy. When we got home, I tidied the living room, stacking books, folding blankets, picking up the trail of toys she had left in her morning enthusiasm. The space looked different somehow, though nothing had changed. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the absence of tension that had once seeped into corners and lingered behind every decision. I lit a small candle on the table, its flame steady and low. The child curled beside me with her stuffed rabbit, leaning her head against my shoulder without saying a word. She didn't need to. Some forms of peace are understood without being named. As evening settled, I stepped outside for a moment of air. The sky had shifted to a deep gold, the kind that signals the day is ready to let go. Neighbors watered their plants, porch lights flickered on. A stray cat trotted down the sidewalk with purposeful steps. Everything ordinary, everything beautifully unremarkable. I leaned against the railing and inhaled slowly, letting the cool air fill the spaces where tension once lived. Not all victories look like triumph. Some look like a quiet neighborhood at dusk, a child safe inside, a binder finally closed. I felt the stillness settle around me, patient and generous. Before bed, I opened my notebook one last time and wrote the closing sentence of this long, winding chapter. Order held. I closed the cover gently, not with ceremony, but with gratitude for the steadiness I had fought to build and protect. The child was already asleep, breathing softly, her small hand resting on the blanket as though reaching for something gentle in her dreams. I turned off the lights, letting the darkness settle, calm, even, without hidden edges. Tomorrow would be simple again. Not perfect, not extraordinary, just simple. And after everything we had walked through, simple felt like a future worth choosing. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. No slammed doors, no raised voices, no final showdown. Just a quiet morning, a plain white ruling, and the soft understanding that order had finally taken root where chaos once lived. I watched my child sleep that night, her breathing steady, her small hand resting on the blanket as though she trusted the world again. And maybe that was the real victory. Not the agreement, not the documents, not the timelines, but the peace that settled into our home once the noise faded. I learned that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it is a single, steady boundary held again and again until the world has no choice but to adjust around it. And as I closed the final page of this chapter, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Room. Space to breathe, to rebuild, to simply live. If this story touched you or reminded you of something you've lived through, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more stories like this, quiet, emotional, real, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.